Kiznaiver is among the handful of most talked about series from this spring season, and the single element that probably comes up in these discussions most frequently is the show's melodrama. Did this development take anyone who saw Mari Okada credited as the screenwriter and/or read the series synopsis by surprise? Not likely, but I think this series provides one of the best platforms for the exploration of a term that is as widely used as it is overly vague. The term melodrama has become almost ubiquitous among the anime fandom in recent years as a go-to buzzword, and an often lazily employed cudgel with which to express one's displeasure for a series in scant detail. To play devil's advocate, the term does hold some value in that it lets one quickly describe a response to a series that could otherwise require a meticulous explanation of why a series failed to resonate with one on an emotional level. But having this shorthand being employed so often has led to a real lack of critical discussion about those meticulous details. Along with that comes contention, as those who enjoy a given series are understandably frustrated by this one word being used as if its presence was an automatic indictment of a series' quality. Especially when the question of when drama crosses the line into melodrama is such a subjective one. As vague as the term is on a colloquial level, though, it is actually fairly well defined. The origin of melodrama lies in mid-18th century theater, where some productions began to have accompanying musical arrangements that would alternate with the spoken recitations. The first full melodrama happens to have been penned by Jean-Jacques Rousseau in 1762, the same year as another significant work of his, The Social Contract. It evolved from there, with the music getting further synthesized into performances and with certain cultures, such as Victorian England, developing their own sets of stereotypical character archetypes, a feature that is one of melodrama's defining traits. By the late 19th century, the term had begun to acquire some of its negative connotation, being largely relegated to salon entertainment. In the modern context, a melodrama is a work of fiction that seeks to evoke an emotional response, often using sensationalism towards that end, with the development of its cast beyond stereotypical archetypes being of secondary concern. This is, in essence, the critique of melodrama, and the source of much of the ire that it draws. A melodrama values the elicitation of an intense emotional response so highly that it has no qualms with manipulating the audience in order to get that desired response. And many melodramas see little need to characterize their casts very deeply beyond that which is necessary to convey that emotional experience. We can see how elements of the melodramatic philosophy have become incorporated into modern artistic mediums through something such as film scores, a feature which seems like the natural evolution of theatrical melodrama, and yet there remains a fairly strong stigma against the device as a whole. Let's set our Western perspective aside for a moment, though, because this stigma is not universal. Many Latin dramas embrace melodrama wholeheartedly, and as many of you may have seen at some point, so do dramas from a number of Asian cultures. For so long, Western art criticism had been fixated on objectivity, and even if many critics have adopted a more postmodern mindset, the allure of the objective review is still very strong for many of those who consume them. Melodrama flies in the face of this, challenging critics and consumers alike to view the piece not through a series of predetermined and universally applied standards and checkboxes, but through the lens of their own personal experience with it. The task of conveying a work of art's appeal not based upon technical merits such as a well-written story, or intellectual values such as interesting and thoroughly explored themes, but upon the reaction that it can evoke is an immensely challenging one due to the abstract and personal nature of the appeal. We've finally made our way back to Kiznaiver now. Every week I see similar sentiments being expressed towards the series. Excellent directing, undermined by a lackluster script. The characters aren't getting significant development, etc. Many of the characters in Kiznaiver are pretty simple, although most of their backstories are unique enough to carry some level of novelty, but they are certainly not great characters, or even pretty good characters in the general sense of the terms. What they are, however, is a cast of excellent melodrama characters. Except for Hisomu. I haven't been able to find a purpose for him yet. The two primary sources of pathos that Kiznaiver utilizes are messy adolescent romance, and the attempt to establish friendship in the face of personal hang-ups and feelings of isolation. Both of these are fairly universal and easy to structure events around, textbook melodrama, and the cast of characters that Kiznaiver is working with provide excellent buckets with which to plumb these wells of emotion. Let's start with the pair of quite simple characters, Chidori and Tenga. Both of them fit into fairly common archetypes and play integral parts in Kiznaiver's love triangle, pentagon, amoeba. We have the childhood friend-zoned Chidori, whose earnest affections for Katsuhira and desire to protect him are easy to understand, and made even more sympathetic through her frustrations with his distance and restrained emotions, something many audience members will likely share with her. Then there's Tenga, the ultimate wingman, roommate, and overall bro. These types of characters can sometimes be frustrating, but the lengths that Tenga goes to in order to help Chidori, and the amount of restraint that he displays make it tough not to root for him. Next we have a pair of characters that are a bit less archetypical, with unique backstories but not as much development as the final pair I'll discuss. Yuta is our ladies' man, with a strong sense of vanity driven by the obesity of his earlier years. He is initially drawn to Maki by his love of the Oppai, but when he discovers the self-hatred that she possesses, we see a more compassionate side of Yuta, likely born out of his own struggles with that issue. The dynamic that exists between this playboy, who is actually quite awkward about any kind of romance that goes beyond the level of a casual facade, and Maki, whose only initial interest in him is a kind of self-loathing lust, is certainly great melodramatic material. Then there's our resident bundle of joy, Nico. Fear of being hated for her inherited gifts of a wealthy family, natural intelligence, and good looks leads her to adopt a highly eccentric persona. Nico gives us two primary emotional points that are highly compelling. The desperate efforts of a character who forces herself to be constantly quirky and upbeat to bring together and ease the tensions of a group of people whose relationships are fraught with conflict are highly sympathetic, as is the struggle to be frank with one's true emotions when one's life revolves around acting out a facade. When a character like Nico is finally overwhelmed to the point that their masks drop and they lay bare their frustrations and heartbreak, it's an impactful moment. The most complicated members of our main cast are the closest to typical good characters that we get, and indeed, Maki specifically is generally referred to as what I wish the rest of the characters could be like. Maki is an interesting take on the character who fears close emotional bonds with others as a result of a previous loved one's death, because even back then Maki realized the danger of getting close and tried to prevent herself from getting too attached to Ruru. Maki refused to read Ruru's solo final chapter of their manga in order to save herself from what she believed would be a spiteful farewell. It's a great tragic backstory, and when she does eventually realize the flaws in her philosophy of interpersonal distance, it means that her treatment of her relationship with Ruru was the wrong choice, meaning that realization carries some significant weight. In the more typical interpretation of the character, they acquire that philosophy due to having let themselves get too close and being hurt by it, and so a realization that that is indeed the right choice provides them with a sense of resolution, as they see that they had actually made the correct choice. Not so in Maki's case. She instead gets that resolution by reading the final chapter and discovering that Ruru had been kind and understanding to her, providing closure, but also making her own callousness seem even crueler by contrast. And finally, we come to Katsuhira. Many of his peers have some kind of trauma that makes it difficult for them to connect to others, but Katsuhira is unique in that his development in that area is literally stunted on a physiological level as a result of early Kizna system experimentation. He is troubled by his lack of ability to relate to others and experience meaningful emotion, but his own inherent level of detachedness makes it difficult for him to express or act upon these frustrations. His past is certainly the most hammy or heavy-handed of these characters, but that doesn't stop it from being pretty tragic. One interesting trend about these groups of characters is that as we move up from less to more complex, the characters get less likable as people. My personal interpretation of this is that the less likable characters required more concrete backstories and characterization in order to justify their personalities. If Maki didn't have such a strong reason for being so hostile, she'd just come off as a bitch, and all of the complaints about Katsuhira's detachment would carry a good deal more weight if the series didn't do so much to justify his state of mind. Few people will take issue with Tenga, so he needs little defense, and someone like Yuta only needs a brief, simple justification for his actions. Perhaps even more than the characters, however, the narrative of Kiznaiver is brilliant from a melodramatic perspective. The closest thing to an overarching plot in Kiznaiver is the attempts of the Kizna Committee to elicit emotional reactions from the main cast. The show's plot is literally about creating scenes that are as dramatic and emotional as possible. The term forced drama has recently risen to prominence as a substitute for melodrama, employed by those who have realized how meaningless the term now is, but who would nevertheless like to have a convenient broad term to describe negative feelings towards a series. Forced drama is incredibly interesting in relation to Kiznaiver, because as I have just described, the drama in that series is forced upon the characters within the context of the series' narrative. It is one of the few instances where that term might actually be apt. There is also Katsuhira's character arc throughout the series. He is trying to regain his pain, and that is slowly caused by experiencing the other Kiznaivers' emotional pains vicariously through the Kizna system. While other characters often receive development as a result of emotional and dramatic occurrences, we once again have this fascinating phenomenon where within the context of the series, it is literal emotional drama that drives Katsuhira's development. In the case of someone like Maki, many of the scenes that contribute to her development happen to be dramatic, But the fact that these scenes are dramatic is somewhat incidental. The emotion itself doesn't cause her to overcome her hang-ups. Her realization that her philosophy towards interpersonal relationships was flawed does, and that scene just happens to be portrayed in an emotional manner. This is drama that is forced in the more general use of the term. The creators made the scene emotional. That is why the term has little meaning, because by this measure, almost any work of art is forced, in that it attempts to manipulate the audience into feeling something. What it generally ends up meaning is that the drama felt unnatural, illogical, or unearned in some way. In Kiznaiver, it's about as earned as it could be, because the people driving the plot have a narrative reason behind causing dramatic scenes. When phrased in these terms, the premise sounds very odd. The plot is that an organization is trying to force a group of teens into having as many dramatically emotional experiences as possible, and the protagonist's character arc is that he uses vicariously experienced instances of intense emotion in order to regain his stunted abilities to experience such things for himself. It is, however, the ultimate premise for a melodrama. Few premises could better justify a large volume of scenes of overwrought drama, and I think the ingenuity of this structure has good reason. As divisive as she is, Mari Okada is probably anime's most prolific writer at the moment, and as Digi aptly described, it's queen of melodrama. She has been developing the craft for years now, and though many in the West look down upon the melodrama, it is a legitimate genre. I believe that her reputation would be much better if people abandoned their rigid conceptions of quality and began to engage with her works and others in the same style on a level that included a more open-minded approach to the consumption of media. If they did, they might be able to appreciate Kiznaiver for the masterwork of melodrama that it is.